It began in the quiet towns and wild forests of the American Midwest. Long before the Iron Brigade earned its name, before anyone imagined the bloodshed to come, a group of rugged, determined men were answering a call. Not for fame, not for glory, but because the Union, the very idea of it, was in danger. From the rolling farms of Wisconsin to the plains of Indiana and the great woods of Michigan, they left behind their fields, families, and simple lives, and walked into history. These men were different. They didn't wear the standard blue forage caps like the rest of the Union Army. Instead, they chose towering black felt hats, Hardee hats, unmistakable on any battlefield. It wasn't regulation, but it set them apart. And that was just the beginning. Their discipline was sharp, their resolve sharper. They were first called the Black Hat Brigade, but destiny had a harsher name waiting for them. In 1861, they were organized under the command of General Rufus King, forming what was then just another brigade among many. But everything changed when Brigadier General John Gibbon took command. Gibbon was no politician. He was a hard-nosed professional, a West Point graduate with piercing eyes and a strict code. He didn't care where these men came from, he cared about who they could become, and under him they drilled. They trained endlessly. They moved like machines, fired like veterans, and marched with silent fury. Gibbon didn't just mold soldiers. He forged a weapon. Then came their first tests. Second Bull Run, August 1862. The Union Army was reeling. Confederate forces under General Lee had struck hard, and panic rippled through the lines. But amid the chaos, one brigade didn't break. In fact, they stood firm. In the face of musket fire and Confederate charges, these Midwesterners held their ground with a fierceness no one expected. They fired volley after volley, reloaded under fire, and refused to yield an inch of soil. Officers on horseback shouted commands above the roar, while black hats bobbed steadily along the smoke-choked lines. A war correspondent, watching the scene unfold, remarked to a nearby officer, "Those men fight like they're made of iron." And in that moment, a name was born, the Iron Brigade. It wasn't just a nickname, it was a badge of honor. It meant endurance. It meant unshakable courage under fire. It meant marching headfirst into hell and coming out swinging. The men themselves wore it proudly, knowing they'd earned it not with words, but with grit. Back in Washington, their reputation spread like wildfire. Officers whispered their name with respect. Other regiments spoke of them in awe. Confederate soldiers, hearing they were facing the Iron Brigade, braced for the worst. But for the men in black hats, none of that mattered. They weren't interested in praise. They were fighting for something larger than themselves, for their states, for their brothers in arms, for the fragile hope that the Union could survive. They didn't know what lay ahead. Not the cornfields of Antietam, not the woods of Gettysburg, not the endless blood and smoke that would test every inch of their name. All they knew, standing shoulder to shoulder on that field in Virginia, was that they would not run, and that was the moment history started to bend. The Iron Brigade wasn't formed in a day. It was forged in discipline, baptized in fire, and tempered in loyalty. They weren't the largest unit, or the best equipped, but when the bullets started flying and the line began to buckle, they were the ones you wanted next to you. Because when the Union needed men of iron, it found them. September 17, 1862. The morning sun rose slowly over the fields near Sharpsburg, Maryland, casting a pale light across the tall stalks of corn swaying in the breeze. But that breeze carried something unnatural. The smell of powder, the tension of silence before thunder. The Union Army was preparing for a battle that would become the bloodiest single day in American history. And at the very front of that storm stood the men in black hats, the Iron Brigade. They were the first to move. Ordered to attack just after dawn, they advanced toward a place that would soon become infamous, the Miller cornfield. It looked harmless at first, peaceful even, but within minutes it would be soaked in blood and echoing with screams. As they entered the cornfield, the Iron Brigade encountered fierce resistance. Hidden within the rows were Confederate soldiers under Stonewall Jackson's seasoned fighters. Ready to unleash hell, what followed wasn't a battle. It was a slaughter. Gunfire cracked like lightning. Smoke swallowed the field. Corn stalks were shredded by bullets. Men were hit before they could even raise their rifles. One soldier would later say it felt like walking straight into a hurricane of lead. Still, the Iron Brigade pushed forward. Step by step, volley by volley. Reloading under fire, shouting above the roar, ignoring the horror around them. Bodies fell, officers dropped, yet the black hats never wavered. By mid-morning, the cornfield was unrecognizable. Piles of the dead lay where crops once stood. Blood ran in trenches where irrigation once flowed. The Iron Brigade had been torn apart, but they had held. And more than that, they had driven the Confederates back. It was a tactical victory, but at a horrific cost. Of the roughly 800 Iron Brigade soldiers who entered that cornfield, over 400 were killed or wounded, a casualty rate that defied logic and survival. Their ranks were shattered, their regiments decimated, but they had done what few others could. They had stood their ground in the deadliest corner of the battlefield, and came out the other side. General McClellan himself noted their performance. Commanders spoke their name with respect. And for those who witnessed their stand, it was clear this wasn't just another brigade. These were men who had stared death in the face and refused to blink. But for the survivors, there was little celebration. They looked around and saw empty spaces where their friends had stood that morning. The black hats they once marched beside now lay in the dirt. The price of their name iron had never felt so real. They left the field not with cheers but with silence. Their faces hollow, their uniforms stained, their numbers forever changed. But their legend had grown. Across the Union Army, soldiers spoke of the black hats in hushed tones. They were no longer just a disciplined unit, they were warriors. The Iron Brigade had become a symbol of endurance, sacrifice, and unbreakable. Resolved. The cornfield at Antietam would be remembered as a place of chaos, courage, and carnage. And at the heart of that memory, the Iron Brigade stands tall. Not because they were untouched, but because they were tested in the crucible of war, and did not break. This was no longer just a war to them, it was personal. Every comrade lost, every inch of ground taken paid for in blood. And they were willing to pay that price again and again. Not because they wanted to, but because they believed the Union was worth it. Antietam wasn't their final battle. It was just the beginning of their legend. July 1st, 1863. The air in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania was heavy and still too still. Just beyond the town, thunder echoed from the west. Not a storm, not today, it was cannon fire. The Confederates were coming. Union troops were still pouring in, unprepared and scattered, but leading the defense, arriving first to face the oncoming gray tide, was the Iron Brigade. By now, their name was legend. Soldiers across the Union Army whispered of their bravery. Confederates cursed the sight of their black hats. But the men themselves? They were tired. Many were new replacements. Few remained from the cornfield at Antietam. And yet, when they heard the call to form up just west of Gettysburg, they didn't hesitate. They fixed bayonets, adjusted their black Hardee hats, and moved into position like they'd done a dozen times before. Before them stood General Het's Confederate division veterans, advancing fast through the morning mist. The Iron Brigade was ordered to hold McPherson's Ridge, a stretch of woods and farmland just outside the town, their job. Delay the Confederates, buy time, but no one said for how long, or at what cost. They moved into Herbst Woods dense, shadowy and soon to be soaked in death. Without waiting, they attacked. Not waited to be hit, but struck first. Like a hammer out of the trees, the Iron Brigade slammed into the Confederate lines, catching them off guard and forcing them back. It was one of the few times in the entire war that a Union brigade launched the opening assault. The woods exploded with musket fire. The air turned black with smoke. Men disappeared into the trees and never came out. Whole companies vanished in minutes. But still, the black hats surged forward. The 24th Michigan, barely on the field for a year, suffered blow after blow, but held their ground. The 2nd and 6th Wisconsin, already bloodied from previous battles, Fired until their rifles overheated, they captured hundreds. They forced back one of Lee's best divisions, but the cost was staggering. More Confederate troops arrived. The Iron Brigade's flanks were exposed, ammunition ran low. Officers were cut down, some giving orders with bullets in their chests. Colonel Lucius Fairchild of the 2nd Wisconsin lost his left arm and kept fighting. One soldier later wrote, "There was no room for fear, only fury." By the time the order came to fall back, the damage had been done both to the enemy and, to themselves. In just a few hours, the Iron Brigade had lost over 1,200 of its 1,800 men. The 24th Michigan alone lost more than 70% of its strength. The ground they defended was littered with fallen comrades, shattered muskets, and torn regimental flags. But their stand had bought time, critical time. Because of them, Union reinforcements were able to reach Cemetery Hill and take the high ground, a move that would change the course of the entire battle. The Iron Brigade, what was left of it, fell. Back not in defeat but in triumph. They had done the impossible. Again, Gettysburg would rage on for 2 more days. But the tone had been set on day 1 by the Iron Brigade's fury, discipline, and willingness to stand when everyone else might have run. After the smoke cleared, their names were etched into history. But for the survivors, victory felt hollow. They had won. But nearly all their friends were gone. Men who had marched together for 2 years were now lying under white wooden crosses. Gettysburg had proven they were iron. Yes, but it also showed what iron costs. Asterisk, the Iron Brigade never truly came home, not all of them, not completely. After Gettysburg, the war rolled on like a storm that wouldn't end. And the men who still wore the black Hardee hats kept marching deeper into it. But something had changed. The brigade wasn't what it once was. The faces were younger now, unfamiliar. The once mighty regiments, so feared, so fierce, were now shadows of their former selves. Battered by glory and crushed by loss, they fought on anyway. In the tangled wilderness of Virginia, where the trees seemed to bleed. At Spotsylvania, where muskets were useless and men fought hand-to-hand in muddy trenches. At Petersburg, where months of brutal siege replaced the quick violence of open battle. The Iron Brigade, though hollowed out, never broke. They endured, but their legend, the real Iron Brigade, had already been written. It lived in the fields of Antietam, in the shattered woods of Gettysburg, and in the impossible stand at Second Bull Run. That was where the myth was born. And for those who survived, that legacy weighed heavier than any rifle. When the war finally ended in 1865, the survivors returned home. Not as conquering heroes, but as quiet, worn-down men. Some were missing limbs. Others bore wounds that never healed. And all of them carried memories they could never quite put into words. They'd fought for something bigger than themselves, and left parts of themselves on every battlefield to protect it. In the towns of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Indiana, flags were raised, names were read aloud in courthouses, and gravestones were placed by trembling hands. Mothers searched faces in the crowd, hoping for sons who wouldn't return. Wives received folded letters instead of warm embraces. Children grew up with stories instead of fathers, but even in silence, the Iron Brigade remained a symbol. A symbol of what it means to stand when standing seems impossible. To hold the line not because you're ordered to, but because your brothers, to your left and right, are counting on you. Their legacy was never about winning battles, it was about refusing to surrender your principles. No matter the cost, today, scattered across the battlefields of the East, you can still find monuments. In Gettysburg, a statue of a lone soldier in a black hat stands watch over McPherson's Ridge in Antietam. Markers dot the cornfield where hundreds fell in minutes. But the Iron Brigade's true monument isn't carved in stone. It's in every story of courage, passed down through generations. It's in the values they carried, duty, discipline, loyalty. And it's in the quiet understanding that greatness doesn't come from invincibility, but from endurance. They weren't special men. They were teachers, farmers, shopkeepers. But in the fire of war, they became something rare, something unforgettable. They became iron. And when you walk those battlefields today, if you listen closely, the wind through the grass might just sound like boots marching. Faint voices calling out commands, the echo of men who gave everything and asked for nothing. If this story moved you, if the legacy of the Iron Brigade deserves to live on, help U.S. keep their memory alive. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this with others who believe history is more than dates and names. It's sacrifice, courage, and honor. This was the story of the Iron Brigade, and it's one worth remembering.